My name is Ollie Lansdowne, and I work with students in London. I live just under the BT Tower with my wife Katie and a hamster that I love like a human child. The CU is hosting this week, as Silas said, because we think that Jesus is good news for students in Southampton today. I'm going to be sharing a bit about that in this talk, and afterwards, as Silas said, we're going to have a time of Q&A. We're having that because we value questions and the people who ask them, so we'll try to get through as many of those questions as possible, and my commitment to you this lunchtime is that any honest question gets an honest answer. You can use the Slido code #Freedom2023 to submit and to upvote the questions you most want answered. Okay, let's make a start. The question I'm going to be addressing today is a big one. Why would God care who I sleep with? And at the top, I want to say, we're going to be talking about some very personal things, and you don't need my permission to leave at any point, but you absolutely have it. I will not be offended. That could be because what I'm saying is painful, and your own story testifies to that truth. We're going to be talking about sexual violence this lunchtime, and if that's a painful conversation you need to protect yourself from because of previous or ongoing trauma, please do feel free to leave at any point from now on. But you might want to leave because you find what I'm saying painful and you strongly disagree with it. I think if you've had the courage to come to an event where a Christian is talking about sex, then the least I can do is be honest. So I want you to know up front that I'm going to be defending the traditional biblical idea that sex is only for lifelong marriage between one man and one woman. And it may be that people like me, defending sentences like that, have been squashing you down for years. If that is you, I want to thank you. Coming along today was a brave thing to do, and I want to thank you for treating me better than other people have treated you. And I also want you to know that just because you came, it doesn't mean you need to stay. If you want to leave at any point, please know you are absolutely free to without any embarrassment. And let's all agree to be a space where someone doing that isn't met with stares or muttering. One more thing on this. Talking about sex matters. For centuries, the West pulled a veil of shame over sex that provided cover for countless abuses and untold violence. Over the last few decades, feminist and LGBTQ communities have been tireless in tearing down that veil of shame by demanding that we talk honestly about the ethics of sex. I want to applaud those communities for that. And my hope is that this talk and the conversations we have afterwards will honor those efforts by being shame-free and honesty-full. We value questions and the people who ask them. So as I said, we'll be having a time of Q&A at the end of my talk. My commitment to you is that any honest question gets an honest answer. So please do send your questions in as we go. But back to that question. The question I've been given this lunchtime is, why would God care who I sleep with? And my aim is to convince you that it is plausible that he does, and it might be good news if he did. But before we get to that, I want to raise a deliberately strongly worded question. It's a question provoked by one of the starkest problems facing student culture today, which is the horrific prevalence of sexual violence and the reality of rape culture that enables it. Here's my question. Is all sex a form of exploitation? Is all sex irretrievably violent? Looking at the 21st century West and actually the whole history of human sexual violence, I want to suggest that we can't easily ignore that possibility. We could talk about internet porn. A 2010 study of 50 of the most popular porn films on the internet found that 88% of them contained physical violence. Internet porn is a multi-trillion-dollar industry that actively profits from the consumption of sexual exploitation, especially the sexual exploitation of women and children. But we could also talk about sex and nudity in film and in TV. At the 2013 Oscars, Seth MacFarlane sang a song called "We Saw Your Boobs," in which he listed 16 actresses, many of them in attendance that evening, together with the films in which they'd appeared topless. It was a song delighting in the consumption of women's bodies with zero repercussions for the consumer and zero care for the one being consumed. We could talk about sexual exploitation at university. Professors having sex with their students is a well-worn trope, but let's not be naive about it. The power dynamics involved in that relationship, well, they aren't a bug, they're a feature. It is much easier to take advantage of a student who is dependent on you for success. We can talk about sexual exploitation within marriage. It took until 1991 before marital rape was made illegal, meaning marital rape has only been illegal for as long as I've been alive. And horrifyingly for me, sexual exploitation and domestic violence seem to occur within Christian marriages as frequently as outside of them. A recent survey found that rates of domestic violence amongst Anglicans in Australia are tragically even higher than in the general population. We could talk about teenage rape culture. March 2021, the Sunday Times publishes an open letter accusing Dulwich College of being a breeding ground for sexual predators, listing 100 anonymous accounts of sexual assault and harassment linked to the school. You don't get tragedies like that unless the culture in which teenagers are being raised feeds on and promotes sexual exploitation. Just last year, the gaming company Roblox, used by 2/3 of American 9 to 12-year-olds, made headlines around the world for failing to protect children from the proliferation of sex dungeons on their platform. And at this point, let me pause, because that's pretty overwhelming. Let me pause and say, if you are currently the victim of sexual exploitation or abuse or harassment, can I encourage you to seek help? You can find some ways to do that at susu.org/support, and I'd encourage you to talk to someone that you trust about finding that help. So let's return to that deliberately strongly worded question. Is it possible that all sex is a form of exploitation? Is all sex irretrievably violent? I think we need to take that question seriously. And I hope that one of the first subjects that would come up in each of those conversations about sex would be the pivotal role of consent. And the fact that most of us are aware of consent is a very, very, very positive step. Education around consent has been one of the most prominent measures taken against sexual exploitation in the last few decades, and that is something to celebrate, because consent is foundational to any healthy physical relationship. It is impossible to have a healthy sexual relationship when only one participant wants it or has the power to stop it. Consent is fundamental. And if you're in a relationship in which only your own physical desires have any bearing on what you do in that relationship, well, you need to stop and seek help. The principle of consent is embedded at the heart of our national conversation about how to navigate sexual ethics, and long may that continue. But today, I want to suggest that consent isn't actually enough. Consent is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. It is impossible to have healthy, ethical sex without consent, but it's still possible for consensual sex to be problematic, partly because consent is not a trivial concept. As soon as we talk about consent, we need to talk about things like capacity and coercion and context and culture. But more fundamentally than that, consent is not enough, because even if you have given the explicit free consent to another person, well, that doesn't mean they aren't exploiting you. Because here is a hard and poignant truth. Exploitation begins in the heart. And that means you can objectify, consume, and exploit someone without them ever knowing. On the London Underground, there's recently been a campaign to educate Londoners about sexual violence. Posters have been put up with words alongside their definitions: upskirting, flashing, catcalling, and then this one behind me, staring. The poster explains that intrusive staring of a sexual nature is sexual harassment, which is true, isn't it? If you're a woman, you'll probably know that firsthand. But don't miss what makes staring exploitative. Do you notice the difference between an innocent gaze and a harassing stare isn't something I do with my body, it's something I do in my imagination. It's possible to feed yourself on someone simply by staring at them, and the consent of another person is not enough to control or validate all the things I might want to do to them in my head. You may not be harming them, and they may not even know, but I want to suggest that doesn't make it okay. And here's one way that you know consent isn't a big enough solution here. A world where we started asking people for their consent to objectify them would not actually be a better world. Put bluntly, asking for consent whenever someone made me feel horny would make the problem worse, not better. Exploitation begins in the heart because, and this might be the most important thing I'm going to say, sexual exploitation, well, it doesn't grow out of ignorance, it grows out of lust. Almost 2 years ago in London, the case of Sarah Everard made news headlines around the world. Sarah had been walking home from a friend's house in Clapham when she was pulled over by a police officer who kidnapped her, drove her to Durham, raped her, murdered her, and then burned and disposed of her body. Her story went viral as a stark example of the dangers that women face from men. And each time a story like that makes news headlines, which is much less often than it actually happens, well, my Instagram feed is filled with posts urging men to do one thing: educate ourselves about the daily struggles and fears that women face. And whenever that happens, I want to say yes and amen. Education is crucial, and the women who have taken the time to explain their experience to me have done me a huge service. But do we really think it was ignorance that made that police officer rape and murder Sarah Everard? Do we really think the problem was that that police officer just didn't know that exploitation was wrong? Of course not. It wasn't ignorance, it was lust. Lust is the desire to consume someone else for your own gratification. It's the desire to use someone else's body as an altar for your own self-worship. That police officer knew that Sarah Everard was a human being with rights, dignity, and infinite worth. He knew, he just didn't care. He wasn't acting out of ignorance, he was acting out of lust. Which means, friends, education will never be enough, because you can still want something that you know is wrong. Friends, consent can't contain your lust, and education can't stop it. They're important, but those solutions are not big enough. Sexual exploitation doesn't grow out of ignorance, it grows out of lust, the desire to consume someone else for your own gratification. And while I hope that no one in here has let their lust grow as strong as that police officer did, I just don't believe there is a heart in this room that doesn't have those seeds of lust in it. Consent can tell me something about the ethics of what I do with my body and with someone else's body, but it can't speak to the habits of my imagination. Education, well, it can change my mind, but it can't change my heart. So can I invite each of us to take a moment to be honest in our own hearts this lunchtime? Be honest with yourself. Have you ever gone even a month without undressing someone in your mind and consuming them in your imagination? Or a single week? Or maybe even a single day? Did you ever stop to ask whether that person might mind? And even if they didn't mind, would that actually make it okay? Do you know, according to Jesus, objectifying another human as a tool to gratify your own lust is always wrong, even if you're only exploiting them in your imagination, and even if they've consented to their own objectification, because treating people like objects is never okay, even if they say they're okay with it. Treating people like objects for my own self-worship is never okay, even if they give me permission. And this gets us back to our title, because this is why God cares who I sleep with. In a nutshell, God cares who I sleep with because what I do with my body says something about what's going on in my heart. God cares who I sleep with because what I do with my body says something about what my heart desires. Our fundamental problem goes deeper than what we do with our bodies and what permission we have to do it. It goes all the way down to what we want in our hearts. God cares who I sleep with because what I do with my body says something about what my heart is devoted to. And if what I do with my body says something about what my heart's devoted to, then what that means is that ultimately, all sex is actually an act of worship, shaped by the story that I'm living for. As I wrap up, let me explain what I mean by that. What I do with my body says something about what my heart is devoted to, about who or what I'm worshipping, and about what story I'm living for. If I'm living my life to worship myself, then what I desire in my heart will be the purpose I use my body for. If my heart desires sexual gratification from somebody else, I will devote my body and my imagination to try and get that from them and from their body. I'll seek to use their body as an altar for my own self-worship. The story I live for will be the story in which others give themselves to me. But if I'm living my life to worship the God of the Bible, the God who made each and every human being of infinite value to be known and loved by him, the God whose goodness is written into nature itself, the God whose love is made visible in the fittingness and fruitfulness of the sexual differentiation between men and women, the God who loves humanity for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. If I'm living my life to worship that sort of God, then that will be the purpose that I devote my body to. The story I live for will be the story in which God gives himself to earth, God gives himself to humanity, and this is why sex is so powerful. Sex was made as a good gift by a good God to tell a massive story. Because the story in which God gives himself to us is a very, very big story. It's the story that the whole Bible is all about, the story of the marriage between heaven and earth, the story in which heaven says to earth, all that I am I give to you, and all that I have I share with you, and joy multiplies out to fill the universe. The story in which God loves the world like a groom loves his bride, in which he is devoted to us like a husband is devoted to a wife, and in which our devotion to him brings the world to life, turning heaven and earth into one big joyful family. Friends, if sex is worship and you worship that sort of God, then maybe you can see how the traditional Christian view of marriage starts to make some sense. If what I do with my body says something about what my heart is devoted to, and my heart is devoted to the God who loves this world with the devotion of a husband and a wife, then I will use my body to tell that story. Whether I'm telling that story by having sex within marriage, or I'm telling it by not having sex outside of it. If I'm married, I'll tell that story by devoting my body to my spouse, finding joy in our sexual differentiation, and multiplying that joy out by blessing the world with children. And if I'm single, I'll tell that story by devoting my body to God, knowing that even if I never have sex, I will never miss out on what sex is actually for, the story that sex is all about. As a friend of mine said, in Christianity, marriage shows us the shape of God's love, and singleness shows us its sufficiency. You see, the reason that Christians are willing to live with so many limits on what we use sex for is because we think that what sex is for is so much bigger and better than sex itself. If you don't believe that sex is worship, well, the idea that sex can be wrong, even if it doesn't harm someone, will just never really make any sense. And if you don't worship the God of the Bible, then it will never really make sense to devote your body to the story of his love for the world. But if you believe what you do with your body says something about who you are worshipping, well, then you might begin to understand why sex is so powerful, why using sex thoughtfully is so necessary, and how it is possible to never have sex in your life without ever missing out on anything that really makes life worth living. Because what sex is about is just so much bigger and better than sex itself. And what sex is about is a story big enough and good enough for everyone in this room. God cares who I sleep with because he cares about what I do with my heart. And as the author David Bennett once says, sex gets old, but worship doesn't.